Okay, let's dive in. Have you ever, listened to someone speaking English, maybe on TV or a podcast or just chatting, and you're just struck by how natural they sound? Effortless almost. It's not
Mhm.
just understanding the words, right? It's the way they speak, that rhythm, the tone, how it all just flows
Oh,
together.
absolutely. It's a really common goal for language learners, isn't it? That feeling that you've gone beyond just like textbook correctness to
Mhm.
something more intuitive, where English feels almost as comfortable as your own language.
Yeah.
And, often that idea of sounding natural feels really tied up with needing to live abroad for ages,
Mhm.
pure immersion.
Right, like you absolutely have to be there soaking it up through your skin or something,
Ah,
osmosis style.
exactly.
But the source material we're looking at today, well, it makes a really interesting case against that. It's saying, hey, it's not really about where you are. It's about the techniques you use. This document we've got, it's basically a blueprint, a detailed guide focusing specifically on how you can learn from native speakers and sound more natural wherever you happen to be.
That's it exactly. And our mission today in this deep dive is to really unpack this guide's approach, systematically break it down. It offers really concrete steps, specific insights into how native speakers get that natural sound,
Mm-hmm.
and, maybe more importantly, how you can train yourself to do the same thing.
Okay.
So we'll look at specific ways to listen, a pretty powerful copying method I talked about, how to build up your vocabulary with natural phrases,
Things people actually say.
right? And also the common traps to avoid, the pitfalls. And we'll even touch on some of the cultural stuff that's kind of embedded in how English is spoken.
It sounds like it takes that big, kind of vague goal, sound more native, and actually gives you a practical roadmap, a step-by-step path.
It does.
And it starts, which makes sense, with maybe the most fundamental skill, listening.
Yeah.
But listening in a very, very specific way.
Yeah, that's the foundation the guide lays out right at the start.
Yeah.
The first big instruction isn't just listen to more English. It's observe how native speakers talk.
Observe how.
Exactly. It emphasizes that you need to tune your ear beyond just, the dictionary definitions.
Yeah.
You have to start noticing the musicality of it, the
Yeah.
tone, the rhythm, and something the source really highlights as absolutely key,
Mm.
how words connect together in natural speech.
Ah, connected speech. Okay, yeah. This is where it gets really interesting, I think, because it kind of pushes back against how a lot of us are initially taught, right?
Yeah.
You learn words as these separate things, pronounced clearly, individual.
Beads on a string.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But this guide's saying, hang on, native speakers. They rarely do that when they're just talking naturally. The words blend. They flow into each other.
Precisely. And this blending, this connected speech,
Mhm.
is what the guy argues gives native English that feeling of speed and smoothness.
Mhm.
It's not necessarily that individual words are spoken faster, although sometimes they are,
Yeah.
but it's that the joins between the words are just seamless. Right.
Sounds at the end of one word often link up with the next one. Or sometimes they even change the sound at the beginning of the next word. It's quite dynamic.
And the guide gives those brilliant everyday examples that just instantly make sense when you hear them explained. Like, what are you doing?
Classic.
If you said each word super clearly, what are you
Yeah.
doing? I mean, anyone would understand you, but
But it would sound pretty robotic, wouldn't it? A bit stiff to a native listener.
totally. And the guide shows how, in just normal, fast-ish speech, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Very, very often shrinks down and links up to sound more like, what you doing?
What you doing? Yeah. And think about the actual sound changes happening there. The 10 sound at the end of what? Well, it often turns into more of a chat sound or something like it when it's followed by you.
Right, the teb plus you often makes chat. Exactly.
Yeah.
And the vowel in R often gets reduced right down to a quick O sound, a schwa, or it just gets squished as the words link. And the G at the end of doing, very commonly dropped in casual speech. So what are you doing becomes what you doing. It's like a whole cascade of little changes.
It really is. And the other example it uses is just as common. I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
Again, saying I don't know is perfectly fine grammatically, understandable, but it's just not how it usually comes out in conversation, is it?
Not usually, no.
Yeah.
The guy points out this phrase almost always becomes something like, I don't know.
I don't know. 2 syllables.
Right. So what's happening there? Well, that thin sound in don't,
Right.
when it comes right before the end sound in no, it often just disappears. It gets dropped. And maybe the vowel sounds in don't and no get a little shorter, but reduced too. So I don't know. 4 distinct words. Just flows into, I don't know, much smoother, much faster.
And the guide really stresses that getting your head around these connected forms and eventually being able to use them is super important. Because, as it says, it makes your English sound faster and smoother.
It really does. It's part of the audio texture of natural speak.
Yep, texture, that's a good word for it.
And the guide is pretty clear. If your goal is to sound more like a native speaker, you have to train your ear to actually hear these connections. So when you're watching movies, listening to podcasts, talking to people, don't just focus on what did they say. Focus on how did they say it.
Right. How did those words link up? Where did sounds change or even vanish? How did the whole phrase kind of flow?
Exactly. That conscious observation, that active listening for these features is the essential first step. You can't really produce sounds you can't reliably hear.
Right.
Right. So you're basically building a mental library, a map of the sounds of natural connected English.
Okay, so you start there, become a super keen observer, train the ear for these connections, these rhythms, then what? How does the guide suggest you actually practice making these sounds yourself?
Right, so listening is step one. Step two is getting active. And this is where the guide introduces a technique it calls shadowing.
Shadowing.
Yeah, it sounds simple, but the guide emphasizes it's incredibly powerful for actively working on your pronunciation, your rhythm, your intonation, all of it. Shadowing is basically, well, it's mimicry. Linguistic mimicry.
Mimicry, like literally just copying someone.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
But in a very structured way. The guide lays out a clear, step-by-step process for how to do it. Step one, find yourself a short bit of audio. Native speech could be just a sentence or two from a TV show scene, maybe a line from a podcast, or a little clip from YouTube. The key thing is short. Keep it manageable.
Okay. Find a source, pick a small chunk, like one sentence.
One sentence, maybe two. Then step two is all about focused listening and immediate repetition. You listen to just that one short sentence or phrase. Really listen. Then you hit pause on the audio.
Pause. Okay.
And your job right then is to repeat that sentence, trying to imitate exactly how the original speaker said it. Exactly. The guide really stresses this. It's not just getting the words right. You're trying to match the intonation, the melody of the voice, the rhythm, the speed, even like the emotion the speaker put into it.
Wow. Okay. So you're trying to capture everything you noticed in that observation phase, the connected speech, the tone, the ups and downs, and replicate it right after hearing it.
That's the idea. Listen, pause, repeat.
Yeah.
Aiming for maximum fidelity, maximum similarity to the original sound.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Listen, pause, repeat.
Got it.
What's the third step?
The third step, according to the guide, is where it gets maybe a bit trickier, but potentially even more effective. You play the audio clip again, but this time you try to speak along at the same time as the original speaker.
At the same time. Whoa, that sounds challenging.
It absolutely is. And, that's probably why it works so well. The guide uses this great description for this phase. It's like being an echo. Yeah. You're simultaneously listening really intently to the model speaker and producing the sounds yourself, trying to stay perfectly in sync.
Yeah.
The goal is to match their pace, their intonation changes, their pronunciation, all in real time, like you're speaking right on top of their voice.
Okay, I can see how that would force you to really process the sound quickly. This must be where that Friends example the guide uses comes in handy, Ross's big line.
Exactly. The guide uses "we were on a break" to make the whole shadowing process really concrete.
Yeah.
So you imagine hearing David Schwimmer deliver that line, right? With his specific kind of agitated rhythm and emphasis.
Very distinct.
So following the steps. First, you'd listen, pause, and try to repeat it exactly like him. Get that slight crackle in his voice, the stress on break. Then, the harder part. You'd rewind, play it again, and try to say it with him, perfectly synchronized, matching his timing, his pitch changes, everything.
Wow. And the guide actually explains why doing this, especially the simultaneous part, is so effective.
It does. It gives this really vivid analogy. It says shadowing is like training in the gym, but for your voice.
Huh. Okay, I like that. A voice gym.
Yeah, because it is a physical workout in a way. You're actively training your mouth muscles, your tongue, your vocal cords to make the specific movements needed for native English sounds and rhythms. You're literally building muscle memory for pronunciation patterns, for that natural flow.
So it's physical practice.
It's physical, but it's also training your ear at an even deeper level, isn't it? It forces your brain to process those native speech patterns and instantly use them to guide your own speech production.
Yeah.
At the same time, it really sharpens both your listening perception and your speaking production skills together in a very integrated way.
Okay, that makes a ton of sense. So first, you train the ear with focused observation. Here are the details. Second, you train the voice and the ear together through this active shadowing, this mimicry.
Right.
That covers the sound production side really well. Now, the guide then shifts gears a bit, moving beyond just the sounds and rhythm to the actual words we use, the vocabulary, but with a specific angle, right?
Yeah, exactly. It pivots from how you see things to what you say, specifically focusing on using natural expressions. The guide makes this great point that many learners, even if their grammar is good and their pronunciation is decent, can still sound a bit, well, stiff or maybe textbook-ish.
Right, like they learned it from a book, not from talking to people.
Exactly. And often it's because they're using phrases that are perfectly correct but maybe a bit too formal or just not what native speakers tend to use in everyday casual situations.
Mm.
So the guide argues, to sound truly natural, you need to learn and actually use the common real-life phrases that native speakers reach for automatically.
It's that difference between just being grammatically correct and being idiomatically natural, especially in informal contexts.
Precisely. And the guide gives some really good concrete examples to show what it means. It takes common situations or functions and offers more natural-sounding alternatives. For instance, expressing agreement. Instead of always defaulting to, say, the slightly formal "I agree."
Which, again, is totally correct grammar-wise. Nothing wrong with it. But yeah, maybe not what your friend would say down the pub.
Probably not, no.
Oh.
So the guide lists alternatives that you hear all the time in casual chat. Things like totally or exactly.
Yeah, much more common.
Or maybe something like, I couldn't agree more, if you feel strongly. Think about how often you actually hear those compared to just a flat, I agree. Using these instantly makes you sound more, well, natural, authentic.
Definitely. And it does the same thing for when you don't know something, right?
Yeah.
Moving beyond just the standard, I don't know.
Right, I don't know is perfectly fine, of course.
Yeah.
But the guide suggests more natural options you can use, like, I have no idea. Adds a bit more emphasis, maybe.
Or I'm not sure, to be honest.
Yeah, that one's great. Adds a nice little conversational touch, softens it a bit. And then there's the guide's other example, which is a classic informal one. Beats me.
Beats me. Yeah, that's a fantastic example. It's short, it's punchy, you hear it all the time in, say, American English,
Mm-hmm.
and it's exactly the kind of phrase you probably wouldn't find in the first chapter of your standard English textbook.
And that's precisely the guide's point.
Yeah.
Learning these specific common alternatives, these more idiomatic phrases, is what can make your English sound, as the guide puts it, more authentic and less robotic.
Mm. It's not about throwing out the standard phrases, obviously, but about building up a bigger toolkit of expressions, knowing which phrase fits which situation, especially the informal ones. That way you sound more like someone who just naturally uses the language rather than someone who's constantly translating or reaching for the most basic option. It's about the social vibe of the words, too. So observe the sound, copy the sound, use the natural words and phrases. That seems like a solid plan. But the guide also spends some time warning people, right, about potential mistakes, things that can actually trip you up when you're aiming for that natural sound.
Yeah, this is the guide's reality check section, you could say, the practical watch out for this advice. It identifies 3 main traps that learners can fall into, which can actually slow down their progress towards sounding genuinely native-like.
Okay, what's the first trap?
The first one it flags is trying to speak too fast.
Ah, yes. That old myth, faster equals more fluent.
Totally. The guide specifically warns against falling for this. A lot of learners seem to think, if I just speed up my talking, I'll sound more like a native speaker.
No.
But the guide clarifies, look, native speech isn't just fast. It has rhythm, it has flow, and importantly, it has pauses in the right places.
Right, natural pauses.
Exactly. So trying to just crank up the speed without having mastered that underlying rhythm and the connected speech we talked about can actually backfire. It often leads to speech that sounds rushed, unclear, and actually less natural, not more.
It's like trying to run a race by just flailing your arms and legs as fast as possible instead of finding a smooth, efficient stride. You won't get very far.
That's a perfect way to put it. You need to control the smoothness before you worry too much about raw speed. Clarity first.
Okay, so don't just try to talk fast. What's the second pitfall?
The second one is related to that vocabulary point we just discussed. The overuse or misuse of slang.
Ah, slang. Yeah, that feels like it could be tricky territory for learners. Definitely part of sounding natural sometimes, but risky.
It really can be. The guide acknowledges that slang can be fun, and it's obviously part of how people really talk, But then it immediately follows up with a warning. It can sound very unnatural if you overdo it or if you use it in the wrong situation.
Like trying too hard.
Exactly. Or just getting the context completely wrong. The guide gives this kind of funny, maybe slightly exaggerated example to make the point. Imagine someone trying to sprinkle, "Yo, bro, that's lit," into basically every sentence they say.
Right? Okay, yeah. Regardless of who they're talking to or what they're talking about.
Right. That immediately paints a picture of someone trying way too hard and sounding, well, pretty awkward, right?
Carefully awkward.
So the guide's underlying message here seems to be using slang effectively requires a really good feel for context. The social situation, who you're talking to, your relationship with them, and what that specific slang word really means and implies. What's cool and natural with your friends might sound completely ridiculous or even offensive in a job interview.
Absolutely. Context is everything with slang. And it changes so fast, too.
It does. So a learner who tries to just pepper their speech with slang they've picked up, thinking it's a shortcut to sounding native, can easily miss the mark and end up sounding less natural or worse. The guide advises caution, use it appropriately, which means understanding the context deeply.
Makes sense. Okay, so don't force speed. Be careful with slang. What's the third pitfall the guide mentions? This one sounds almost too obvious, but maybe it's crucial.
It's absolutely fundamental, according to the guide, and it's simply neglecting to practice speaking out loud.
Just not doing enough actual talking.
Exactly. The guide observes that lots of learners spend tons of time on listening, reading, input, consuming the language, which is great, it's necessary. But they don't dedicate enough time to actively producing the language, speaking it. And the guide is really direct about this. It says, basically, if you don't practice speaking out loud consistently, your pronunciation and your overall fluency just won't get better.
That really rings true, doesn't it? Listening trains your ear, helps you understand, builds your internal model of the language. But speaking out loud, that's the physical act. That's training your mouth, your tongue, your breath, your vocal cords to actually make the sounds, to create the rhythms you've been hearing.
Precisely. They're completely complementary skills, input and output. But one cannot replace the other if your goal is to improve your speaking. You can listen forever, but if you don't practice making the sounds, you won't improve at making the sounds.
Seems logical when you put it like that.
So the guide really hammers this home. Active, out-loud speaking practice is just non-negotiable if you want to sound more natural. You have to take what you learn from listening and shadowing and actually do it. So wrapping up the pitfalls section, the advice is focus on smooth, clear speech, not just speed. Use slang judiciously, paying close attention to context, and crucially, make speaking out loud a regular, consistent part of your practice routine.
Okay. We've got the mechanics, observing, copying, using the right words. We've got the warnings, speed traps, slang traps, lack of practice. The guide then seems to zoom out a little, right? To look at the bigger picture, bringing in cultural aspects and other specific language features.
Yeah, this part of the guide adds another really interesting layer. It talks about the cultural dimension. It makes the point that, especially in many English-speaking cultures, how you speak isn't just about getting your message across. It can significantly shape how other people perceive you.
How they judge you, almost.
Well, yeah. The guide specifically mentions that things like your tone of voice, your pronunciation, can lead people to make judgments about, say, your confidence level or how friendly you seem.
Wow. That's a really powerful reminder that language is deeply social. It's not just a technical skill. It's how we connect, how we present ourselves.
Absolutely. Your voice carries a huge amount of social information beyond just the words. And the guide uses the concept of intonation, the melody, the rise and fall of your voice, to really illustrate this. It takes that super common, simple phrase, "How are you?"
Okay.
And it asks you to imagine saying it in two different ways. First, imagine saying, "How are you?" Completely flat, like a robot. No pitch change, no rhythm.
Monotone. How are you?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The guide says, yeah, that would sound really unnatural. Maybe even cold or like you're bored or uninterested to a native speaker's ear.
Right. Doesn't sound very friendly.
But then it contrasts that with saying, "How are you?" Using a nice, friendly, rising intonation. Maybe lifting your pitch up a bit towards the end, perhaps on R or U.
The way you normally hear it as a greeting. How are you?
That upward lift. The guide states really clearly, that kind of intonation sounds warm and natural. It immediately signals friendliness, engagement, interest.
That's such a simple but effective example. The exact same three words. But the music of how you say them completely changes the message, the feeling.
Totally. It shows intonation isn't just some technical detail about pitch patterns. It's a primary tool for conveying emotion, attitude, and those crucial social cues. The guide really makes you see that how you say something can be just as important, sometimes even more important, than what you say in terms of connection.
Definitely something to pay attention to. Beyond intonation, the guide also mentions another specific linguistic thing, right? Especially in American English, reductions.
Yes, reductions. Those are those super common shortened or blended forms that pop up all the time in fast, casual speech.
Things we probably use without even realizing we're shortening them.
Absolutely. The guide gives the classic examples: going to becoming gonna,
I'm gonna go now.
right, and want to becoming wanna.
Do you want to get coffee?
Exactly. We use these constantly. And the guide explains why it's helpful for learners to get comfortable with these reductions. It says it helps you blend in more with native speakers.
Ah, so it connects back to that whole connected speech idea again.
It really does. Reductions are basically like extreme examples of connected speech, where sounds or even whole syllables get squished or dropped because the words are flowing together really quickly and efficiently. So being able to hear these reductions when others use them, and eventually using them yourself in appropriate situations, makes your English sound less careful, less stilted, more fluid, more like the actual sound patterns you hear in everyday native conversation.
Okay, so this whole section on culture and specific features like intonation and reductions, it kind of reinforces everything else, doesn't it? It shows that sounding natural isn't just about hitting the consonants and vowels right. It's the whole package. The rhythm, the melody, the way words blend and reduce, and understanding that all this stuff matters for connecting with people too.
That's a great summary. The guide's advice here is essentially keep doing that focused listening we talked about at the start, but really tune your ears specifically for these features. Listen for the intonation patterns, listen for the rhythm, listen for where words reduce like gonna and wanna. Internalize how they actually work in real speech.
And then presumably use shadowing to practice making those sounds and melodies yourself.
Exactly. It's that cycle again.
Yeah.
Observe deeply, then practice actively, listen, then mimic.
Well, this deep dive into the guide's outline, it really feels like it's laid out a very thorough, a very practical framework. You start with that focused listening, understanding the nuts and bolts like connected speech. Then you move to active practice like shadowing to build the physical skill. You layer on using natural everyday vocabulary. You watch out for the common mistakes like speed and slang. And finally, you bring in those broader nuances of intonation, rhythm, reductions, and even the cultural side.
It really is a very actionable plan, isn't it? For anyone who's serious about wanting their spoken English to sound more natural, less like they're reading from a script. And importantly, the guide doesn't just leave you with the theory. It actually suggests ways to put it all into practice right away.
Oh, right. It proposed that specific challenge task, didn't it? For the learner reading the guide.
Yeah, a little three-step exercise based directly on the core methods we've been discussing.
What was it again? Step 1 was find a short clip.
Yep, find a short English video or podcast clip. Step 2, pick just one sentence from that clip and shadow it. Really focus. Try to mimic the original speaker's delivery, the sound, the rhythm, the intonation, as precisely as you possibly can.
Okay, shadow one sentence. And step 3.
Step 3 was about activating that natural vocabulary. The challenge was, try to use one new natural phrase that you've learned maybe from that clip you shadowed, or from the guide's own examples like totally or beats me. Try to slip one of those into a real conversation sometime that day.
Ah, I like that. Applying it immediately.
Exactly. Make it real. And the source also mentioned an idea about interaction, suggesting learners could share who their favorite native speakers are to listen to and learn from, kind of building a community around this practice.
Those kinds of tasks really drive home that this isn't just information to know, is it? The guide is saying this requires active, consistent effort. You have to do it.
Absolutely. It's practice-oriented. And the guide even gives a little peek ahead, mentioning practicing speaking alone as another useful technique for fluency, suggesting it's a layered approach with more to explore.
So hopefully this deep dive into the source's outline has given you, our listener, a really clear picture of the strategies, the techniques, and the thinking behind this guide's approach to sounding more natural.
Yeah, you now have a good overview of the tools and the awareness this particular source highlights.
Yeah.
Things you can start experimenting with.
Right now, really, wherever you are, it really emphasizes that it's about intentional practice, isn't it? Not just passively hoping it'll happen someday through sheer exposure.
Intentional practice is key. And maybe that leads us to a final thought for you to take away, something building on these themes from the guide. Just take a moment to reflect on your own English learning journey. Thinking about all the elements this guide brought up, really getting the hang of connected speech and reductions, the physical practice of shadowing, building that collection of natural phrases, tuning into intonation and rhythm for cultural connection. Which of those areas feels like the one where you personally have the most room to grow right now? Or maybe, which one feels like the biggest hurdle, the most challenging thing to tackle? What single point from this guide really stands out to you as maybe the most important insight for your next step in sounding more natural?
Hmm, that's a really good question to ponder. A lot to absorb today, and definitely even more to put into practice. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into this fascinating blueprint for natural sounding English.
Yeah, thanks for listening. Keep observing, keep shadowing, keep talking, and enjoy that process of refining your voice and connecting more authentically when you speak English.